You're listening to the Vint Wine Podcast, where you'll hear interviews and stories from around the wine world. From writers and critics to winemakers and sommeliers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping wine culture. Enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Vint Wine Podcast. I am your host, Billy Galenko, and today we have a special winemaking guest, Alban Debeaulieu of Abbott Claim from the Willamette Valley. Now, for those of you who have listened to the podcast for a while, you will know that I am a big fan of the wines coming out of the Willamette Valley. I've loved their Pinot Noir for a long time, and in recent years have really fallen in love with the Chardonnay. And this producer, Abbott Claim, makes both of those. I haven't actually been as familiar with them prior to this podcast, which, as someone who fancies themselves kind of a connoisseur of Oregon wines in general, I was kind of surprised. But I came across them and was able to coordinate an interview with Alban, their head winemaker, and also get to taste a couple of their wines. I will share a little bit more about the wines in a minute, but for a little bit of background on Abbott Claim, the estate vineyard is located in the Yamhill-Carlton AVA. They also make Chardonnay with fruit from the Eola-Amity Hills. The estate is actually owned by Anthony Beck, who is from South Africa. He is of Graham's Beck fame. He also owns Steenberg Winery in South Africa. Graham Beck you may be familiar with particularly for their Cap Classique sparkling wines. Alban was the winemaker from the outset, specifically chosen by Anthony Beck, kind of for his love of the area and their shared vision on the types of wines that they wanted to create. Alban, he's from France. He cut his teeth in Burgundy, working with the Rhône family, and then made his way over to Oregon, worked at a couple other properties, and then connected with Anthony. Now, the Abbott Claim vineyard itself was actually originally planted by Ken Wright, who is, if you know your Oregon wines, you will know that Ken Wright is a very famous name in the world of Oregon wine. So this vineyard had some prestige to come along with it. And then they decided on the name Abbott Claim for the vineyard when they purchased it by naming it after a settler who had actually originally owned the original claim to that piece of land in 1855. So this settler had driven across the Oregon Trail. For those of you who are of my same generation, maybe you played the Oregon Trail. Maybe he had to do some fording of rivers in his covered wagon, or maybe he had to, overcome some diseases along the way. I always think about that video game when I think of the Oregon Trail. He was one of the original Oregon Trail settlers and made his claim in 1855 to this piece of land. And they have all of the original documents dating back from every person who has owned this piece of land, dating back from John F. Abbott to the modern day. The vineyard was planted by Ken Wright in 2001. So the vines on the estate vineyard themselves are already over 20 years old. And they are producing very interesting wines coming out of the Willackenzie marine-sandstone soil that they are planted on in the Yamhill-Carlton district. From the estate vineyard, they make an estate Pinot Noir, and they also have a couple smaller single plot Pinot Noirs that they make as well. And like I mentioned, they also have a Chardonnay coming from the Eola-Amity Hills from some really high quality vineyards there as well. And the wines are just very, very high quality. The whole estate was founded with the ethos of lower intervention, organic farming, respect for the land, respect for the natural characteristics of the vines and the wines. So they take good care to not really do that much to the grapes after they get into the winery in terms of manipulating the final wine. They have very meticulous farming practices, and then they bring in really high quality fruit. They're sorting out anything that's not perfect. And then in the winery, something that they do that I found very distinct and I hadn't really heard of that often is they let the wines age on the gross lees. Now, you may hear a lot of wines, being aged sur lie or on the lees, but typically they're racked off the gross lees, which is the larger pieces of solid material that precipitate down to the bottom during fermentation. So these might be dead yeast, but they also might be like pieces of grape skins that might have made it through the pressing, or some pieces of other organic solids that have made it through the original pressing. And these gross lees are, able to give a different character to the wine. They're able to give more texture. They're able to absorb some oxygen. So they have a lot of effects. And I thought it was really interesting tasting both their Pinot Noirs and their Chardonnay. You could tell that they were made by the same producer, the same style. They had the same, like, kind of je ne sais quoi. I hate using that, but I don't know how else to describe it, even though they were both produced from fruit that was grown in two different areas. So you could definitely see the Abbott Claim house style come through in their wines. And they were both very, very high quality, very full of life, concentrated. So I will definitely be seeking out more Abbott Claim. And it was really interesting to hear from Alban, how they kind of came to produce the wines that they do, all the work that goes into the vineyard and the winery, and then how this all came about as a part of a shared vision between him and Anthony. It was a really, really great conversation, and it really opened my eyes to the fact that no matter how well you think you know a region, there are always new producers to discover and more wines to try. So I hope everybody appreciates as well. If you're not already an Oregon wine lover, you should be. And hopefully after this interview, you will be, because the wines coming out of the Willamette Valley are fantastic and they're only getting better year over year. Alban shares some great insight into recent vintages, the quality of this year, and all the work that is going on in the area, specifically in their vineyards, to make even better wines coming up here in the near future. So without further ado, here is our interview with Alban Debeaulieu of Abbott Claim. Hi, Alban. Thanks so much for joining today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Now, I'm really excited because listeners of this podcast will know that I'm a big fan of the Willamette Valley and Oregon wines in general. And it's rare that we get to interview someone who's kind of starting a new but already highly respected project from the region. So I'm really excited to dive in about Abbott Claim. But could you maybe give a little background on you and how you got started in wine and winemaking? And then we'll dive in.
I am French. My family is from the Loire Valley. I grew up in the southeast of France in the Rhône Valley. I did my studies in Burgundy, studied agronomics, viticulture, and then enology in Dijon. And after having worked for the Drouin family for Maison Joseph Drouin in Beaune, I had the chance to come and work a harvest in Oregon, and I never got to leave. Just work opportunities came along and made me stay in Oregon.
Did you grow up around wine as a child as well, or were you kind of drawn to the industry just over time?
Yeah, I would say I was drawn to the industry as a child. My family was not in the wine industry, did not own a domain, a commercial wine operation, but I had two grandfathers on each side who were very much involved in wine, either as customers. I had a grandfather who would spend a lot of time in cellars in the Loire Valley, in Alsace and in Burgundy, and during summer vacations, I would do that with him and bottle some wine by hand and so on. And I had my other grandfather, my father's father, in Vendée, alongside the Atlantic coast, had a few rows of vines that he would tend himself and make some wine in his garage. And I was also around that quite a bit. So between those two things and the fact that there was a lot of cooking and wine enjoying, and that visiting cellars was actually a common thing that we would go do on weekends with my parents as well in the Rhône Valley, wine was very much present at an early age and piqued my interest very, very early on.
And then from that, were you inspired that you, through this tasting and through being in this general area, that you wanted to work eventually up in Burgundy? Was that always the goal, or did you think maybe I'll be a Rhône Valley, Châteauneuf-du-Pape producer, or Northern Rhône or something?
It's interesting. There's two aspects to this. First, when you don't grow up in the industry, at least for me as a kid, having only interacted with the wine industry as someone who would interact with winery owners, with vintners, with vignerons, and taste the wines and visit the cellars, I always thought that the only way you could be working in wine was to own a winery, to inherit a winery from your parents and to take over that work and to farm vineyards and make your own wines. I didn't realize that there was an industry that was greater than that. But I especially couldn't imagine that there was a path into the industry for an outsider like myself, that there was a kind of a backdoor to it without being born in it. So, as a kid, I barely knew about Burgundy. Again, having had I only had a few names that existed in the back of my mind. I remember interacting with things like Gevrey Chambertin or Chabrol Musigny when I was a kid through my grandfather. but just I barely knew in what corner of France those villages would have been. So that's one aspect. Being an outsider, I didn't even realize I could be making wine if I didn't inherit vineyards from my family. And number two, my wine education really happens in the Loire Valley with my grandparents and in the Rhône Valley with my parents. And although Northern Rhône Syrah is probably the first smell that ever got ingrained in my mind, it is the first thing that I could blind taste and recognize. There's that vague textbook Northern Rhône Syrah smell, which is just unmistakable. I never, again, until I realized that there was an academic path for me to go into the industry, those were not even thoughts for me.
Ah, very interesting. Yeah, I think we forget sometimes here in the US, like I think a lot of people, very few people inherit wineries here. So everybody thinks you go, you decide you want to be, maybe you study in college and then you join. So I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. Well, cool. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I mean, the term wine, even the term wine industry was even pretty foreign to me. Just imagine there was a whole industry where you could have a job in sales, in marketing, and there's so many satellite occupations that exist around the job of farming a vineyard and making wine. Just even that was a foreign concept to me until I realized that yes, there was a living and breathing wine industry.
Yeah. Again, because it's just so ingrained in culture and in your life. That makes sense. Very cool. Well, let's fast forward then again, getting back to Oregon. So can you just walk us through how your first couple jobs here in Oregon and how you first heard about the Abbott Claim project and got connected with it?
Absolutely. When I finished my master's in enology in Burgundy, I worked for the Drouin family in Beaune, for Maison Joseph Drouin, and then Véronique Drouin was very kind to offer me to come and do harvest here in Oregon. That's their winery in the Dundee Hills. So I came and did that. And quickly after, I was offered a position at a tiny winery in the Dundee Hills, right across the street from Domaine Drouin, called White Rose Estate, minuscule winery. I worked there for a couple of years. After that, I was hired to be the winemaker at 00 Wines, a small project as well in Oregon, which has grown quite a bit since 2016 when I was the winemaker there. And then on a recommendation from Véronique Drouin, actually, Anthony Beck, who owns Abbott Claim, reached out to me in 2017 and invited me to meet him and see if I'd be interested in taking over the farming of the Abbott Claim Vineyard and designing and building a winery and really building a project from scratch. So Abbott Claim as a vineyard existed and it was planted back in 2001. Abbott Claim, the brand, the wines, the label did not exist before my arrival. We created that together.
Oh, very interesting. I guess there's a whole bunch to cover here for what Abbott Claim is. But my first question is regarding the vineyard. You mentioned, I thought there was like Abbott Claim was like an amalgamation. There's a few vineyards that make up Abbott Claim. Is there a base Abbott Claim vineyard and then also?
Exactly. So there's an estate vineyard mainly planted to Pinot Noir called Abbott Claim Vineyard, which was planted back in 2001 by a famous local vintner called Ken Wright. Ken Wright planted the Abbott Claim Vineyard back in 2001, sold it to Anthony Beck in 2012. And when Anthony hired me 8 years ago now, I presented the idea of creating a wine brand that would be called Abbott Claim and really centered around the history of the Abbott Claim vineyards with a winery built on site, and everything stems from there.
Oh, nice. Can you, before I guess we dive into what the history is of Abbott Claim, can you talk a little bit more about the background of Mr. Beck and kind of his role in the wine industry? Because I think that helps provide context for where we are.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Anthony and his family have been in the wine industry since the early 80s in South Africa. So his father created a winery in the early 80s called Graham Beck, which is today, I think, still the largest producer of Méthode Champenoise wine, sparkling wine in South Africa. Anthony also owns a second winery called Steenberg, which is the oldest registered farm in South Africa, which is in Cape Town, in Constantia, right next to Klein Constantia, which is quite a famous winery down there. So Anthony, again, has been in the industry for quite a long time. In 2012, was given the opportunity to buy the Abbott Claim Vineyard from Ken here in Yamhill-Carlton in the Willamette Valley. And that was his first foray outside of outside of South Africa. Anthony had been looking to develop other wineries outside of South Africa for some time, mainly in France and Italy, and just out of serendipity, out of chance, was given the opportunity to start working in Oregon here with Abbott Claim. But actually today we are starting a winery in Burgundy as well. So finally making it back to France with Anthony.
Oh, wow. We'll have to talk about more about that in a little bit, but our listeners will be familiar. We had a special episode, not a special episode, an episode on Clan Constantia earlier this year. We had their winemaker on. So our listeners will be familiar with the area, but I like that story because I think, to your point, if anybody's had any Cap Classique, they will probably be familiar with the Beck name. And then also I thought it was really interesting that he had one of the oldest kind of registered farms there in South Africa. It kind of plays into the same kind of story that you guys have in terms of the property at Abbott Claim. Can you talk a little bit about the heritage behind the actual property before even vineyards?
That's correct. When I arrived here and I saw the vineyards and I realized that there was a story that dated back to the 19th century, we actually have every single deed here that links the original owner of the property back in 1855, John Abbott, the original settler on this piece of land, which was drawn to the burgeoning state of Oregon at the time. We have every single deed that links John F. Abbott to Anthony Beck today. We have every successive owner on paper, which is quite interesting. On the label of Abbott Claim, the drawing that is the back of the label is the plat map that is on the original deed from 1855. So yeah, it's an old property that dates back to the early days of the state of Oregon, where the new government was trying to draw settlers to come and populate the state.
Very cool. I think I don't know if it was the same in France, but growing up, many of us who grew up probably in the late 80s and 90s will have played Oregon Trail here in America. I think everybody is familiar with what happens at the end of that game.
Yeah, if you make it, yeah.
If you do, yeah, you don't die of cholera on the way. So very cool. So can you then talk a little bit more about the vineyard parcels? So I believe they were purchased kind of in 3 batches. Can you talk a little bit about each of them and what makes each unique?
That's correct. Yeah. So in 2001, Ken Wright planted the top of the hill. So on a ridge, on the east-west ridge called the Savannah Ridge within Yamhill-Carlton AVA. 60 million year old oceanic sandstone. So this is old seabed that was pushed up by tectonic activity some 60 million years ago. So we're talking about old sands that deposited and compacted at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean over 200 million years, and then 60 million years ago were pushed up and became continents. This ridge is exclusively made of those sediments, which are barren, really have never been covered by anything, vapor soils. Ken planted the Veit in 01 and 02, and then went about parceling out the unplanted areas of that original land claim and sold it to 2 owners. One bought the west side of the property and planted it in 2003 to Pinot Noir as well. And then Anthony bought the bottom of it in 2005 and started planting it in 2006. And then subsequently, in 2012, he bought the original vineyard that Ken planted. And in 2017, which is the year I was hired, we completed the purchase of the west side, in effect reuniting the original land claim, which by then had been mostly planted out. So today we have about 30 acres of vineyards, mostly of Pinot Noir, that very shallow sandstone, which is really the main characteristic of the vineyard of this terroir. And the Pinot Noirs we produce today come exclusively from Abbott Claim Vineyard. We produce 3 Pinots from Abbott Claim Vineyard, each with their own identity. One wine being the greater expression of the property, the Abbott Claim Vineyard, and then 2 single blocks, micro parcels within Abbott Claim Vineyard, one called Due North, old vines north facing, at least the oldest vines planted on the vineyard back in 01, north facing going into the trees, and one in the heart of the vineyard, particularly steep on eroded sandstone called Orientate.
Yeah, very cool. Well, I want to dive into what each of those maybe express each other, or how each of those wines express themselves. But first, I probably should have done this a little earlier. Can you give us a little sense of where Yamhill-Carlton is in terms of the Willamette as a whole? Like maybe using Portland as the top and Salem or something as the bottom?
Yeah. So we are in the northern Willamette Valley. We are about 50 minutes southwest of Portland. Yamhill-Carlton is a horseshoe-shaped AVA, and that is really tucked in into the northern end of the Willamette Valley, neighboring appellations like the Dundee Hills, Ribbon Ridge, the Chehalis Mountains are all right around us. So it's one of the original sub-AVAs of the Willamette Valley, and one that is really characterized by its old oceanic sedimentary soils.
Would you say you're, and I should probably know this from just being there and visiting, Yamhill-Carlton is like southwest or west further of Dundee, if I were to go sideways?
It's directly west of Dundee. I'm actually looking at the Dundee Hills right now.
Perfect.
Yeah, it is directly west of the Dundee Hills. It is low elevation than Dundee. The Dundee Hills are made of 12 million year old volcanic soils. So we're talking about younger soils with a higher clay content, deep soils, iron-rich soils. The Jory soil series is what people associate with Dundee. And here you're on low elevation, very dry old sandstone.
Yeah, that was great context, because that's kind of what I was getting at is, while people think the Willamette, it has certain things have distinct character and obviously area to area changes, but I don't think without being there, you really realize how different the soils can be from just one AVA to the other, even if they're so close.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. For us at Abbott Claim, again, the roots of the winery are here in Yamhill-Carlton with the Abbott Claim Vineyards, which is on these very hard and poor soils. We're developing our own vineyard in the Erosion Hills, which is another AVA further south. So our Chardonnay production is very much centered in the Erosion Hills. We are currently developing our own property there. And while we've been doing that, I've been purchasing grapes from vineyards such as Seven Springs, Temperance Hill, Ex Omni, and a few others in the Erosion Hills to make our Chardonnays.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, it's quite the hotbed. And I definitely want to talk about the Aola Amity Hills as a Chardonnay base that's really blowing up shortly. But let's go back to the Pinot Noirs. I was able to have both the Chardonnay and the Pinot Noir estate wines. I should have probably had the actual bottle, but I have both of them next to me. Can you talk a little bit about maybe just the general characteristics that the property that you want to convey in the estate wine? Like, what do these sandstones and the overall terroir kind of express through the wine, and what is your hope? Are you helping that shine through, or are you trying to also make an Abbott Claim kind of house style as well?
Yeah, definitely trying to absolutely avoid making stylistic wines. If there's one story that is worth telling in our work, it is that of place. If we're just trying to tell the story of some winemaker's ego or core idea of the moment, I don't find much value in that effort. For us, our work really starts by recognizing what is the story worth telling? Why are we here? What are we doing here? And of course, the most fundamental aspect to what we do is the interaction between vines and a piece of vines. There's nothing more fundamental to the whole equation of grape growing and winemaking. So this here at Abbott Claim, the fundamental parameters that we get to be working with is 60 million year old oceanic sandstone, vines 25-year-old Pinot Noir vines, digging their roots in here, mostly a south-facing slope, a fairly warm and dry microclimate for the northern Willamette Valley, especially when compared to the Erosion Hills, and soils that don't have the ability to hold on to water and hold on to nutrients. So again, making for fairly low vigor and low cropping vines. So naturally, we'll be seeing low crop, small berries, very thick skins, and naturally wines that have a lot of density, structure, color, dark, floral, and spicy aromatics. A very brooding expression of Pinot Noir. For 7 years in Oregon, I worked for someone who really became my mentor, a consultant out of Burgundy, and he would often compare the wines that came out of Abbott Claim Vineyard with those of Moët-Saint-Denis. For the people who know Burgundy, and people always try at least venture into comparing sometimes the Willamette Valley to Burgundy, and sometimes I get the question. So my answer is, well, I wouldn't venture into comparing, but someone with much more experience than I would sometimes draw the parallel between the wines here and Moret. So why not? Structure, dark spices. So that is really these are the characteristics of Abbott Claim Vineyard, and these are the characteristics that we embrace. And our goal is simply to capture that and showcase it in the most transparent, pure, balanced, delicate package, something that is both pleasurable but also uncompromisingly of place of Abbott Claim, and also wines that can age for a long time, hopefully.
That is immediately what came through to me. I opened the wine like right off the bat, and then have tasted it as it evolved in the glass over a couple hours now, actually. And the first thing that hit me was that spice, and then also that like the delicate florality. And I think as on the palate, there's like a concentration of fruit, but there's also like an ethereal type nature to it as well. It doesn't seem like it's dense and heavy in a bad way. It's like very light and powerful, or yeah, I guess light that way as well. I don't know if I'm articulating that properly.
No,
but,
I mean, I agree. For me, density, we will always get dense wines, sometimes almost with a black hole-like density, because there's a lot of extract naturally, but it doesn't have to be expressed in an expansive and heavy way. Mm-hmm. Right? That extract doesn't have to come with volume and power and heaviness. So we're looking to capture density, length, and energy in the wines, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's certainly there. I'm looking at my notes, and I feel like I had a much better word here. Elegant, I guess, was the word I was looking for. But yeah, so I think that it immediately came through. And I think for me, the Willamette Valley always has this, it's almost kind of like an earthiness that you don't typically find in a lot of old or New World Pinot Noirs that's more reminiscent of Burgundy, but there's still that ripe fruit. And I think you guys had this extra layer. I don't know if it's the sandstone that's adding this elegance, but I think there's something more nuanced to it than some of the other Pinot Noirs, maybe from like the Dundee Hills, for example. Can you talk a little bit about what you see in the single parcel or the single block vineyard expressions as well?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing I did back in 2017 when I started was to dig soil pits all over the property to really understand what is the substrate that we get to work with, what is going to be call it the glass ceiling, or the main, most fundamental statistic driver for the fruit and the subsequent wines. The reason why we are bottling two small parcels within Abbott Claim Vineyard separately is because they are, even before we made the wine, simply if you walk the vineyard and you dig you dig a 2 meter deep hole in those parcels, you will see that they are unique. Due north is the only north-facing parcel in the vineyard. It is past the ridgeline. It goes into the trees. It is surrounded by trees on three sides. Maples, Douglas firs, Oregon white oaks all around it. So it has this cool, more humid microclimate. And also because it has this delicate concave slope, it has accumulated and kept a bit more topsoil on top of the sandstone, which makes for a bit of a more balanced life for those vines, and providing them a little bit more nutrition and water through the season. So it was important for me when seeing that the first vines that were planted are actually unlike a parcel that is unlike the rest of the vineyard. It was important to put it in its own bottle. If not, I think it would have been a missed opportunity and a lack of humility if we had just blended it away. It obviously deserves to be shown on its own. And it's not so much about thinking that it will make a superior wine. It is simply thinking that it would be a shame to lose that identity into a greater blend. And then the second wine is just as idiosyncratic. It is maybe the polar opposite of that due north parcel. It is a 20% grade slope, so fairly steep for us here in the vineyard. In the heart of the vineyard, south-facing, exposed to the sun, warm on raw sandstone, no topsoil, directly on sandstone. So here, because the slope is pronounced, and with all the precipitation, all the rain we get in the winter, we get a lot of erosion. And that's really, and that erosion is accelerated by the fact that the sandstone, being mostly sandy, doesn't have a lot of clay, and so doesn't have the capacity the soil doesn't have the capacity to structure itself, to create a resilient structure and hold in place. It doesn't have the capacity to create clay and humic acid complex. It doesn't have the capacity to fix nutrients and stay in place. So with all those rains, we get a lot of erosion, and the little bit of organic matter that might build with our use of cover crop and compost during the season will very often just erode year after year. So those vines are just straight on sandstone. And the goal there is simply to showcase what does Abbott Claim really, what does it boil down to? What is the most primal mineral expression of the vineyards? 60 million year old oceanic seabed, vines on it. What does that taste like?
Awesome. So all of these, I assume, I guess I want to talk about the viticulture a little bit, maybe in a minute when we talk about how maybe climate change or not is affecting what you're doing there. But are these all vinified the same way? Do you have I know everybody likes to ask, but I might as well, about, are you like destemming the same amount for each of these wines, or does each one get a special treatment just because each parcel is so unique?
Yeah, so there's definitely no recipe for us. So the wines will always be trying to thoughtfully adapt to the parcel, the vintage, of course. What I'm trying to get to is that for whole cluster, for example, stems, I personally love whole cluster in Pinot Noir when it suits the wine. Now, in some situations, it may not suit the wine. Stems can be very disruptive elements if it is not well integrated. The same way poor use of new oak can be, for example. And so for me, it is very important the wines are never stylistic, but that's place and purity of fruits always wins. So for example, due north facing, trees all around it. If we are a little too heavy-handed on stems there, the wines will show the stem very early on with a certain stalkiness and herbaceousness that is very characteristic. And it is something that I don't want the wines to be marked by whole cluster. I don't want anyone to put their nose on the wine and just being able to identify a process, a technique. I think the parcel has to be telling the story, not the hand of the winemaker. Although of course we're here and we make a lot of decisions, but hopefully our work is thoughtful and somewhat invisible and at the service of place and at the service of a balanced expression. So due north, we seldom use whole cluster, and if we do, it's 10 or 20%. Or the rest of the vineyards, and Oriental in particular, will usually average between 35 and 40% whole cluster. So there is whole cluster, but it really depends. It depends on so many factors. The vintage, of course, but the terroir, the plant material is very important. So, for example, today, I was just in Burgundy last week to make some wines from a parcel that we just bought. And there it was a very easy decision to go right away with 60% whole cluster. And that was a conservative approach, being my first time vinifying Grands Épinards. But now I know that quickly we'll be able to even go further. So it really, there's no recipe. There's simply a philosophy that we just have to be humble, and we have to make sure that we don't get in the way so much that it's all about us.
That makes sense. And I was just thinking, as you were saying that, Burgundy, I'm sure this is a great year to use stems just because of how the vintage has gone, how hot and dry, and what a good growing season it was. Can you explain a little bit about how the Oregon growing season has been? I actually haven't heard much.
It's actually been interesting. It's been interestingly similar. It's been, especially the month of August has been kind of a carbon copy of Burgundy, with about 2 weeks late. I mean, not the crazy rains that happened in Burgundy when people started picking in Côte de Nuit, but at least the Côte de Beaune season and here have been a bit similar. We had a very strong heat event here in Oregon with a few days at 40 Celsius in late August. And so we saw a few similar things with a bit of dehydration, thick skins, small berries. We also had quite a bit of hens and chicks and coulure, shatter, because of the way bloom went. I mean, overall here we had a very balanced season, a very healthy season. Very high mildew pressure, which I think we handled quite well here at Abbott Claim, although it was quite challenging in the Willamette Hills, in particular on Chardonnay. And the heat came, and now we're about to see the first signs of rain, but we're almost all picked out. Within a week from now, we'll be all picked out. It's been a pretty beautiful vintage. It's going to be hard to beat 2024, which was an absolute dream vintage in Oregon. But yeah, so far so good. High concentration, thick skins, small berries, hands and shakes and shadows. So we have to be very careful with whole cluster, because in a vintage like this, where you have fairly low juice yields with small berries, the impact of whole cluster can be so much greater very quickly, especially if the stems aren't great, if the phenolic ripeness is not ideal. And so we have to be very careful here. We've destemmed a little bit more than in past years at Abbott Claim this year.
That makes a lot of sense. I hadn't actually thought of the juice yield ratio impacting the whole cluster decision. So, that makes a lot of sense.
I mean, actually, in Burgundy, it was the same this year. I mean, I wouldn't be able to speak for the whole cluster purists. And, I'm sure a few months ago I was visiting with Diana Sess at Dujac, and I'm sure those guys kept to, being close to 100% on everything. But at least in the Côte de Beaune, because fruit, at least in our case, was picked before the rains came, we had fairly low juice yields, small berries, and so we had to be very careful about the extract. It would be, but also another way that I personally tackled this last in Burgundy was to no punch downs, pump overs only, to try to again be very, very delicate with our extraction, because we saw tenants coming very early in the fermentations. And again, similar situation. I see a few parallels this year with kind of that strong heat event after veraison, low juice to skin and to solids ratio, and having to be very delicate with extraction.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's funny you mentioned Dujac. I was just thinking we had a Jeremy on just a month ago. So I was thinking about his use of whole cluster and his ethos behind it as well. Cool. Do you want to touch on the farming? Since you guys said you mentioned how you handled the disease pressure that did exist, you guys are regenerative and you try to farm as sustainably as possible. Are you biodynamic? I think I read that. Is that right? Or
we are not certified biodynamic.
Okay.
We've been using biodynamics since 2018, since I arrived, although we're not certified. Now we've been farming fully organically since 2018. For me, organic farming at this point is a common sense baseline that everybody should be following, to be honest, especially in the Willamette Valley, where the season is usually kind to the vineyards. Downy mildew almost does not exist in the Willamette Valley. All you have to be mindful of is powdery mildew and botrytis, and very often at levels that are very, very manageable with an organic program. We farm fully organically. We do utilize some aspects of biodynamic farming, especially in the use of preparations like 500 and 501. We make our own barrel compost and we'll inoculate our compost from our pomace with biodynamic preparations. But it is not, I would say that we use biodynamic the way we see fit, and we haven't been seeking any type of Vineyard certification. And then really the big emphasis for us beyond the organic farming, which is again just a baseline today, is really the use of composts and the use of compost and cover crop during the fall and winter to try to build soil on top of that sandstone. Those soils sandstone being so poor and so hard on the vines, trying to build organic matter, humic acid, is so important to be able to provide to those vines. And doing that work in conjunction with work with Simonette and Cirque. I saw you interviewed Marco Simonette. We've been working with Marco Simonette since 2020, so it's been 5 years now. The work we've been doing with him and his team, and our compost amendments and our work with fall and winter cover crops, has really done wonders in restoring vitality in some blocks that were really suffering from just having lived on those poor soils for so long and having pushed to grow grapes year after year. And these are very hard soils to grow on. I think we've had a very, very light hand since 2018, and it's been a breath of fresh air for those vines.
Fantastic. What are a few of the changes that you guys made that worked well?
Going back to fairly short pruning, being able to read the vigor of a vine and on a vine per vine basis, rather than having vineyard white systems or even block white systems, being able to really understand how to prune each vine differently, and simply being able to read what it can and cannot do, and simply asking of it just enough and not one cluster more. Because asking too much of a vine in a terroir that is so difficult can be a strain over a couple of decades of growth. With dry farms, we're on very dry soils, and being able to prune short with a fine understanding of the physiological system of the vine and its long-term needs for healthy development and life, as well as providing more to the vine through organic compost, has really allowed us to. There was actually a few blocks when I arrived in the heart of the slope here at Abbott Claim that I thought we might have to pull out because they were devigorating so much. And we're actually today able to have them come back to health.
Very cool. So it's like obviously the pruning, the compost, you have these woods around. So there is some like biodiversity and you use cover crops and animals too. Is that right? So it's like all of these.
We've used animals in the past. We don't have any animal husbandry on the farms. Animals is not really a part of our daily operations, no.
Okay, cool. But cover crops, you guys do use those in conjunction with the compost to
absolutely
maintain that humus. Yeah.
Yep.
Very, very cool. Something I did want to ask, and you can confirm whether or not this is accurate too. You mentioned using certain biodynamic practices. Do you use tidal calendars to influence your racking at all?
I use tidal calendars and the moon calendar for bottling.
For bottling?
Yeah. So certainly for bottling. There's a few, bottling is the most disturbing thing we can do to a finished wine. It is. So the being gentle at bottling is pretty crucial for us. And so yes, it's one of several things that we look at is a tidal and moon calendar.
Cool.
To bottle.
Very cool. Can you explain to our audience a little bit about what the tidal, what that does for, especially for bottling? Because I've heard a few times, but I'm still trying to wrap my mind around exactly the nuance.
Yeah, you're simply trying to make sure that anything that will have an impact on the behavior of liquids and the volatilization of compounds between a liquid phase and a gas phase is limited. So simply you want to be bottling or you want to be moving wine when you have low tidal coefficients. Low tidal coefficients means that liquids are seeing less of a direct gravitational pull from celestial bodies. That is why there is a low tides. You also want high atmospheric pressure. And that is much harder to nail down, but ideally you want high atmospheric pressure to make sure that the liquids stay put and you don't volatilize gases out of the liquids. If imagine you have high tidal coefficients and you have low atmospheric pressure, compounds that are in liquid phase and that are volatile will have a much greater tendency to exchange and go into gaseous phase. And similarly, gaseous phase will have a propensity to solubilize and to interact with the liquid phase. So if you don't want that interaction, you want typically low tidal coefficients, high atmospheric pressure. So anything that's, any racking, bottling, particular, those two would be asking for that. For us, bottling is really where we're looking to make sure that we're on the right conditions. And same thing, waning moon is also, finally, when looking at the moon calendar, a waning moon is, according to biodynamic principles, is what you want to be looking for the same reasons.
Interesting. I hadn't heard the higher pressure before, but that makes a lot of sense. I just find it so interesting that, the moon and the tides could pull even ever so slightly, just liquid in even like a tank volume. I just think that's so interesting.
It happened. We're talking about very fine adjustments, but putting all the chances on our side is very important. And then it's also important to value centuries of empirical observations. the thing we're very quick these days to kind of discard empirical knowledge. But yeah, I personally believe that there's a lot of value in centuries of observations, of human observations. And, plant material cells are mostly water, of course, liquids when they're transferred, and when we're talking about hundreds of aromatic compounds, and we're trying to be very cognizant of the volatility, of the redox potential of our product or liquid wine, especially when it is so late in its life, when it's ready to bottle, it is its most sensitive. Every little finite adjustments that we can be mindful of, we try to have on our side.
Yep, I agree. I think that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, no, it's interesting when you mentioning the using that empirical knowledge from history. I think I love wine history, and looking back over wine over time, I feel like there's always like wine will go, and then there'll be a technological advance, and then there's always like everybody wants to do it. Then there's a little reversion to being like, well, some of the things that we did before are still good. We should not throw everything out. And then it's balancing how you move forward, but also look to the past for what worked well.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I know we're getting closer to time here. Let's go down and talk about the Chardonnay now. And I say go down, meaning moving down to the Eola Amity. Just as a broad statement, I think Oregon Chardonnay has really come into its own in recent years. I've tasted some amazing wines. I've also heard a lot of chatter about it in the trade. Can you talk a little bit about maybe just what you're seeing as Oregon as a whole? And then we'll talk about why Eola Amity as a region is so special.
Yeah, there was Oregon wine industry is still quite young. First Pinot Noir in the Willamette Valley was in 1965 with Irie. And Chardonnay has been produced to some level over the years. But in 2007, there was a bit of a pivotal moment if you're just looking at the history of Chardonnay, which is very recent history. We're just talking about some 18 years now. But a project was created back in 2007 called Evening Lands, which brought Dominique Lafon from Meursault to start consulting over Pinot Noirs and Chardonnays in the Willamette Valley, and particularly from the Willamette Hills. And the wines that were produced since 2007 from the Seven Springs Vineyard, with the help of Dominique, were just absolute standouts and pivotal wines. Today, and if it wasn't for those wines, you wouldn't be tasting today the Chardonnays of Walter Scott and Seth Morgan Long and Lingua Franca and Bergstrom and Double Zero and so on. So there was really the wines that Dominique helped make between 2007 and maybe 2012, I want to say, for just 5 years from the Seven Springs Vineyard, just carved the path for a certain approach to Chardonnay, one that is it's very interesting, one that is balanced and quite uncompromisingly qualitative, hopefully, certainly with an eye towards Burgundy. If you think of Chardonnay in America, everyone has in mind what California Chardonnay might represent, what it may have been for the last 20, 30 years. And the burgeoning Oregon Chardonnay production, I would say pre-2007 and even in the 2010s, was very often a bit of a reaction to California Chardonnay. It was an anti-California Chardonnay. And maybe sometimes to a fault. The pendulum may have swung from wines that would have been maybe a little low on acidity, elevated in alcohol, and heavy on new oak, from that to wines that could be a little light of varietal, fruity, and maybe simple sometimes. But more recently, there's certainly a strong emphasis on great terroirs that are going to be conducive to great Chardonnays, as opposed to simply looking at the Willamette Valley through the lens of Pinot Noir, and trying to produce wines that are simply balanced, complex, that may certainly be fermented and aged in oak without necessarily being completely defined by oak. Wines that are complex and wines that are off place and hopefully classic.
Yeah, and then the estate bottling that you guys sent me, I got a distinctly like a smoky, flinty, mineral driven nose along with that concentrated fruit flavor. Is that something you're going for? Almost, I wouldn't say it's like reductive, but maybe a little more in that style.
So just the answer is the same as for the Pinots. We definitely want to avoid I definitely don't want the wines to be too stylistic, but it happens to be that for Chardonnay, a result of my personal philosophy, a byproduct of that philosophy, that approach happens to be that yes, reduction tends to be can develop in the wines. I personally embrace it. I look at reduction in Chardonnay the same way I look at the use of oak and new oak, the same way I would think about the use of whole cluster in Pinot Noir. If it is an element of complexity and it is at the service of the wine, if it is at the service of terroir expression, I am perfectly fine with it. If finding reduction is just like using too much new oak, if it is obtrusive to the expression of wine and to the expression and to making sure the wine is characteristic of place, then it is much less interesting to me. In our case, I personally believe that it is very important if we're going to try to make Chardonnays of place. It is very important if we believe that we're working with a very good piece of land with an excellent terroir that is going to be conducive to making a great white wine through the lens of Chardonnay, with the help of Chardonnay. I believe that we should be asking a lot of the fruit. In our case, it means being fairly extractive. So it might mean crushing, might mean even soaking, pressing very, very hard, a lot of lees, a lot of bourre, a lot of solids, a lot of tannins. And as to complexify the chemical matrix of the must as much as possible. If pressing Chardonnay delicately, I think prevents the possibility of a unique wine, of a wine that is truly of place. Pressing delicately, Chardonnay in particular, which is a very ubiquitous varietal and can be grown just about anywhere on the moon, probably you could press delicately Chardonnay and you get water, organic acid, sugar, varietal aromatic precursors. If you're really going to make a wine that bears the signature of place, you have to ask everything from the fruits. You have to embrace a certain chaos within the must and get as much chemical complexities, and then let the must and wine sort itself out through natural processes such as oxidation, native fermentations, and all of the enzymatic activity that comes with it. And then long aging, entropy, really brings you stability, and the wine will sort itself out and find its balance. And then, yes, as a byproduct, you may find textural and aromatic aspects that come from that use of that extracts, those tannins, those lees. And one of those things might be reduction. That's correct.
Very cool. Yeah, there's certainly layers and layers of texture and complexity. And then, it continues to evolve not only in the glass, but on the finish too for a really long time. I think you've succeeded with that. So great job on that. You mentioned, and something we'll wrap up here in a little bit, but I do want to ask about your élevage kind of regimen for the whites and the reds. And then also you have mentioned you want to make wines that will age well. What elements are you looking in each of these different varieties to help do that?
Yeah, I mean, those two, the way we age wines and making wines that can age, those two things, it is a wine thinking process. It's one whole process, obviously. I mean, first, natural acidity and pH is a pivotal concept, parameter around which the wines have to kind of exist and balance themselves out. But something very, very important for us is that we don't age the wines on lees, on fine lees, on heavy lees. We age the wines on total lees, meaning that both red and whites are never settled before they go to barrel, and are on the heaviest, thickest, grossest, heaviest lees, and spend 18 months on those lees before finally racking them and bottling without finding no filtration.
Wow.
So being able to, I was talking about time, stability, entropy, letting the wines find their place and their natural balance and stability. Being able to have good energy, acidity in the wines, having density and extract, and then having the wines age for a long time on heavy solids is what I believe will give the wines first true terroir expression, aromatically and texturally, give them very unique features. Again, especially talking about white wines, if you're not tapping into the solids, into the extract, I think you're making a wine that potentially looks like the neighbors a little too much. And on Pinot also, lees are incredibly important simply because when you're in barrel, the lees being mostly proteic in nature and also holding a certain reductive potential are going to be a fantastic buffer in relation to the oxygen that comes through the barrel, as well as the elements that are leached from the barrel, aromas and tannins. So the lees are an amazing buffer for barrel aging and are natural protectants for the wine. So being able to age the wines for a long time on heavy solids, wetter whites, allows for the wines to evolve slowly, gain layers of aroma and texture, find their stability, work with oxygen and oak in an harmonious way, and finally being bottled but by the time they're bottled, you've complexified the chemical pool of your must and your wine for such a long time that it's had much time to evolve and find its centre de gravité, its point of balance, and really just resolve itself around it. By then you've found something that is stable for a long time. I mean, right. I think it's been written about more and more, and I'm glad. But something like Primox in Burgundy, I read on, for me, is not about sulfur amounts at bottling or the quality of the cork so much as it is about what is in the wine. How complex is the chemical makeup of the wine? How stable is the chemical makeup of the wine? How was it made? And yeah, I think for us being able to make wines that are chemically as complex as possible at the same time that I found the stability is how we'll make wines that can age for a long time.
I love that. And I think that certainly comes through in the two wines I had. And now you have me intrigued. I want to do more research on that in relation to Primox as well. But I think you guys are setting a great example. I hope more people start now using the gross lees as well. But last question, and then we'll let you go here. One is just on misconceptions about Oregon wines. Like, well, what are some misconceptions about the wines of Oregon right now that you'd want to kind of, I don't even know what the answer is, dispel?
That's a good question. So sometimes I have people comparing Oregon to Burgundy a little bit too often, and that's maybe a local misconception, or maybe a misconception, maybe mostly from an American point of view. For me, there are more differences between Oregon and Burgundy as there are commonalities, and that's perfectly fine. But that's just important to realize that a great wine from Oregon, whether it is a wine that is made of Pinot Noir, a wine that is made of Chardonnay, I mean, it almost doesn't matter. The point is, what is a great terroir here, and how do you tell that story? The terroir of Oregon is unique. It is its own, and it doesn't need to be compared with that of Burgundy. The only commonality is that the story of Oregon happens to be told through the prism of Chardonnay or Pinot Noir. Second, I mean, I think every time people are surprised when they taste a wine from Abbott Claim, often when they taste a Pinot, they maybe realize that Oregon wines aren't all brooding and warm and powerful, and the Chardonnays also can have concentration, energy, and layers that were maybe not expected. I think Oregon today the Willamette Valley in particular is an incredibly dynamic wine industry that, with a lot of Burgundians are coming here because they're being curious. They're hearing about what is happening here. A lot of people from Oregon are spending more and more time abroad to keep expanding their vision. It is so difficult to capture what is or isn't the Willamette Valley today because it's changing so fast.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, I think case in point is the Chardonnay perception, but I think to your point as well, the quality and styles of the Pinot Noir. And I love what you were saying there too about comparing Oregon to Burgundy all the time. I do think Americans like to do that, but whenever I'm at different studies or I'm abroad, a lot of people are just lumping Oregon in with all New World Chardonnays as well. So I feel like it's unfairly lumped with wines that are nothing like it.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think it's a very Oregon-centric and maybe American-centric tendency to wanting to compare the home hub for Pinot Noir and maybe Chardonnay and compare it to the old world champion. But it's, yeah. What's interesting is that today the people I think who are maybe making the Willamette Valley wine industry most dynamic are people who spend a lot of time in Burgundy and spend a lot of time tasting wines in Burgundy. But the one thing that Burgundy teaches you is not how to make wines that taste like wines from Burgundy. What Burgundy teaches you is a philosophy, is to understand what is fundamental to the work, what is the most fundamental parameter to what we produce. The driver, what is important is the character of place. And how do you position yourself? What is your role? How do you position yourself in relation to a piece of land and vines interacting with that piece of land? That is what you learn there.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's incredibly insightful. Well, thank you again for so much time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. That was our interview with Alban Debeaulieu. I hope everybody enjoyed. I hope everybody goes and seeks out some Abbott Claim. The wines were fantastic. The story behind it is fantastic. And they sound like they're only going to be getting better and better as the years go on. So definitely go seek out some Abbott Claim and seek out some Willamette Valley wines in general. I know we've been banging on this podcast for a few years now, but I am a huge fan of the Pinot Noir coming out of the region, and I have really been high on the Chardonnay coming out in recent years as well. So everybody go seek out some Willamette Valley wines. But in the meantime, that is our episode for this week. We'll be back with another 5 questions on Friday and another full episode next week. Cheers.